We're right at the top of the hour. Thank you, Kundanji, for being right on time. We just lost Raghuji. We'll see if we can get him back.
Namaste, everyone.
Namaste, everyone.
So,
Namaste, Kundan.
yeah.
Namaste, namaste, Anandji.
How are you?
Doing very good. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
All right. So there is Kalyanji.
There
Raghuji just got bumped. It looks like he'll join us, rejoin us unless he has internet issues. We're still at the top of the hour. So, try and get Raghuji back on. I will kind of give us the introduction for this week's webinar on Antaranga Yoga, Deconditioning the Mind, right? So we know yoga is more than just postures, asanas, or breathing techniques, pranayama. It's an integral science. And Antaranga Yoga is really focused on helping us develop greater insights, right, into our own psyche, patterns of mind. And in this era, I just think about how my mind, and maybe yours as well, on the social media, how we get into this feedback loop and we get into this downward spiral, but it could also, I think, be a productive, constructive spiral of reinforcing thoughts. So Raghuji has just joined us. Let me give I'll start with Dr. Anand Paranjpe, an introduction, who obtained his PhD at Pune University, conducted postdoctoral research at Harvard University under a Fulbright and Smith-Month grant. All the way back in 1967, he started teaching at Simon Fraser University in Canada, where he's currently Emeritus Professor of Psychology and Humanities. He was invited by the Indian Council of Philosophical Research as National Visiting Professor in 2010 and 11. And some of his major publications include Theoretical Psychology, The Meeting of East and West, 1984, Self-Identity in Modern Psychology and Indian Thought, 1998. And currently he's working on a book on the nature of the transformation of consciousness, as described in several traditional commentaries on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. In general, his focus is on Indic concepts and theories and psychology and interpreting them in light of the language and idiom of modern psychology. Dr. Paranjpe, thank you for joining us today. Next, I would like to introduce Sri Raghu Ananthan Narayanan, who obtained his postgraduate degree in biomedical engineering from IIT Chennai. He's a trained yoga expert, teacher, and coach in the lineage of Sri Tirumalai Krishnamacharya, often referred to as the father of modern yoga, right? He had the benefit of being trained directly by Sri Krishnamacharya, as well as his son, Sri TKV Desikachar. Raghuji has co-founded Sumedas Academy for Human Context, the Barefoot Academy for Governance, and Flame Tao Nowhere. It's a private company. He is now engaged in mentoring a young group of sacred activists called Ritambara, as well as the co-creation of a platform for yoga teachers from Krishnamacharya tradition called Ananta Yoga. And he's going to be teaching Antaranga Yoga for HUA in the fall, one of the courses we'll be talking about today. And our last panelist is Dr. Clinton Singh, who is a core doctoral faculty at HUA and served as a core doctoral faculty at Sophia University for over a decade. He's a scholar practitioner of integral yoga and the darshana of Mother and Sri Aurobindo. He is taught in the areas of integral philosophy and psychology, contemporary and traditional Vedanta, critical thought and deconstruction, post-colonial studies and psychology, Indian psychology and yogic psychology, among a few others. Dr. Clinton Singh is our versatile expert who will round out this panel. He's co-authored a book with Krishna Maheshwari titled Making Children Hindu-Phobic, a critical review of McGraw-Hill's world history and textbooks. So with those introductions of our panelists, I'd like to bring on Sri Kalyan Viswanathan, president of Hindu University of America, who always does a good job of framing these panelists, engaging the audience, and leading us in this important endeavor. So Kalyanji, I hand it off to you.
Terrific. Thank you, Ankur, and thank you all for joining. I want to take a moment and welcome all our members in the audience. Uh, you know, the chat window is open, so you can offer your perspectives and post questions in the chat window. And I just want to exercise the chat window just for a minute by asking a question in the chat window. Kindly respond to the chat window, okay? So the question is, which city are you from? Okay, that's the question. So let's get a sense of who is here. California, Texas, Chicago, Michigan, West Virginia, Seattle, Bangalore, Jersey, Portland, Kingston, Boston, Kansas, Arizona, Salem, Bangalore again, Bangalore. Bangalore is winning in India. New York, Fremont, Vadodara from Gujarat. That's nice. Saddle River, Pune, Dubai. Somebody from Dubai here today. Mumbai, Santa Clara. Okay, very good. Excellent. Okay, so we've got more than 150 people here, and I suspect more will be joining. So very warm welcome to all of you to today's webinar. Okay. Now, the topic of the webinar today has two phrases. The first phrase is Antaranga Yoga, which you might recognize is a Sanskrit phrase. And the second phrase is deconditioning the mind, which is an English phrase, right? So we've put together a Sanskrit phrase and an English phrase together. And I want to begin with the idea of deconditioning the mind, which is in English, and most of us are probably far more familiar with English than we are with Sanskrit. But we will move towards Sanskrit during the course of the webinar. To frame this, I first heard about deconditioning the mind during my early years when I was an avid follower, if you could say that, of J. Krishnamurti. I used to read his books, listen to his lectures. I used to go to his Adayar place on Greenways Road and sit and listen to him while he was alive. And he used to use this phrase, deconditioning the mind, conditioned. We all have conditioned minds. And the ways in which our minds are conditioned by culture, upbringing, what we pick up in the ambience, the environment in which we live, is often in the background and not very clear to us in terms of how it influences and impacts our choices, our behaviors, and even our experience of life. Okay, so let's pick up from that idea and start with Professor Anand Paranjape. So Anandji, within the context of Western psychology, right, in which you have been very deeply steeped in for many decades now,
Uh-huh.
have you come across the phrase deconditioning the mind vis-a-vis conditioning in general? Okay, and how would you frame that phrase deconditioning?
Okay, very good question, because conditioning is a concept with which almost all, at least in my case, education in psychology started with the idea of conditioning, because historically the idea of conditioning goes back to the Russian physiologist who trained his dog by just ringing a bell, bell, and showed that without any natural stimulus, such as meat powder, for instance, a dog could start salivating by just giving a bell. And that was one way in which a stimulus and response are supposed to be joined together, and that's what conditioning is. The general thrust of what is called behavioristic psychology is to assume that there are universal laws of learning which shape human behavior. And the driving force behind that is proper way of rewarding the kind of behavior that you want the person or the animal to emit or start up or continue. So conditioning is something that is used also in shaping behavior other, because if there is abnormal behavior such as fear of something, then you condition it with another set of rewards, and no question of deconditioning appears. It is only reconditioning. Deconditioning is not a word that I have ever heard in 40 years of psychology.
Wow. Okay, very interesting. So, Anandji, a follow-up question here.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, the experiment you referred to, which is the dog responding to the bell.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a famous experiment.
Yeah.
And if I'm not
Pavlov.
mistaken, Isaac Pavlov, right? Now, the question that immediately arises for me is, how is the way a dog gets conditioned to a stimulus and begins to respond in a certain way, how does that apply to the human world? Because obviously the human being is a far more complex and sophisticated entity compared to a dog. I mean, one
Yeah.
would sort of assume that. So can you kindly illustrate
Sure.
how that gets extrapolated?
Just think of a baby, and the mother is nursing the baby, and the baby naturally starts to babble, produce sounds. And one of the sounds that is very common is kind of things. It's natural. So it is from here that the mother tries to train or condition the child. So to say, for instance, mama, and so on. So it is a meow, that's the sound that the baby hears, and it says, this is a meow. So this is how conditioning starts at the earliest level of functioning of the human being, no matter how complex. Without that complexity, this baby would not emit sounds to begin with. But the whole society is geared in terms of rewarding behaviors that are considered as appropriate, and not rewarding or punishing what are considered undesirable behaviors. In other words, the entire social milieu shapes human behavior. Another technical word is conditioning. So that's how it, by and large, we all develop.
So you're saying that we live in a world today, almost universally, that is shaped by ideas of reward and punishment, that unconsciously, unbeknownst to ourselves, we respond to rewards and punishments, or
Yes,
the lack of reward,
yes,
etc. And that begins to shape our behaviors. And that's one of the ways in which we as human beings have learned to get conditioned by the
yes,
social environment in which we live.
right.
Okay,
So
terrific.
yoga, however, approaches in a different way. And one important way of the difference is that, by and large, especially under the influence of modern psychology, which started with learning and conditioning, is basically that it is the environment that shapes you, and the self-initiating power of the individual is underplayed to a very great extent. And that is exactly where yoga comes in, by starting to develop your way of controlling your own behavior. For instance, you train yourself by adopting certain rules for yourself. And that's way it is called vratas are, for instance, examples. That is, I decide not to eat something on a certain day. That's self-control.
Yeah. So interestingly, the notion of deconditioning, which you are saying is not a prevalent notion, is not, in fact, is not even available within
Yeah.
the world of Western psychology, right? If I heard you right, that possibility of deconditioning can only arise inside a context in which being conditioned itself, conditioned in whatever way,
Mm-hmm.
gets problematized, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That the fact that my mind is conditioned, unbeknownst to me, of which I have no awareness, it is all sort of subconscious, unconscious processes going on in my everyday life, and I have no control, no awareness of my own internal pressures and anxieties and so on.
Yes.
And to get deconditioned from all of that requires, first and foremost, an awareness that I am a conditioned human being, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. So one of the ways in which yoga fosters a initiates or process of deconditioning is Swadhyaya, or which means that you start examining who you are. The question, who am I, comes in. And we, of course, have some developed a certain way of thinking of who we are as a member of this family, member of that country, citizen, this occupation and all that. But then, is that exactly what we are? Are we all only what the way in which we are conditioned? Swadhyaya is a very important part of the initial process of starting yoga, in which reflecting on yourself, who you are, is a very important part of the process of getting to be a yogi.
Terrific. Great. I think I'd like to now move to our second panelist, Sri Raghu Ananthanarayanan, who has had the benefit of working closely with the father of modern yoga, Sri Krishnamacharya, as well as his son, TKV Desikachar. Now, of course, in the Western world, yoga is predominantly associated with the asanas, pranayamas, the bahiranga or external yoga. And Raghuji, you are focusing somewhat uniquely on Antaranga Yoga, meaning inner yoga. So I'd like to begin with, what are the premises or axioms behind Antaranga Yoga? Where does it come from, and how do you actualize it for example, in a classroom setting or a group environment?
Yeah, let me start off from where Anandji left off. Yeah, and you were asking him some questions around it. Nah? See, the premise that yoga starts with is slightly different from the usual idea of conscious, unconscious, subconscious. Right? It talks about the mind which is capable of being overcome by sattva guna, which means clarity and lightness, or restlessness or heaviness. Okay, so the popular words are sattva, rajas, and tamas. So when it is overcome by tamas, then we forget a lot of things, we become dull. And it is not only referring to the mind, because in yoga, the idea of the mind as a separate thing from the body or any other part of me doesn't exist. So I'm a full prakriti, I'm one whole being, and I can be looked at from different points of view. So the tamasic would show up physiologically in one way, it would show up psychologically in another way. So memory then gets submerged, my attentiveness gets submerged, and so on. So what yoga says is that there is an experience of the state of clarity and a state of being not conditioned, which is possible for every person. And because there is this experience of a state which is not conditioned, which means I am capable of acting from my independence, which is called swatantrata, I act from a sense of who I am, which is Swabhava. And I act from a sense of what I think is enlivening of my world, which is Swadharma. Because I have this experience and I go away from it, I also have an experience of being triggered from the outside, controlled from the outside, not having choices, meaning making, which is thrust from the outside. So when this experience comes in, I experience what is called dukkha. So in yoga, the experience of dukkha is a constriction of my space, taking away of my independence, being thrust with meanings that don't sit with me, and so on. And the entire focus of both Sankhya and yoga, and in fact, many of the Indian things, is first of all, to say a mind that is in dukkha is not capable of acting with complete focus, with complete attention, with an ethical base, and so on. So it's very, very important for a human being to discover the mind that is capable of acting with clarity and acting from what is called the sattva guna largely. And when you act from sattva guna, your ability to be ethical, to be compassionate is very high. So this is a very critical part of the yogic process. And so the practice is, in a sense, given three critical anchors. One is called tapas. Tapas is various kinds of actions that you do that Anandji was also talking about. You put certain disciplines on yourself, learn how to ripen your system, right? The second part is called Swadhyaya. And Swadhyaya is completely your ability to understand, have an insight into how your inner functions, how your mind functions. And Ishvara Pranidhana, which is the third part, which is to have a sense of commitment or love for the divine. Right? So the Swadhyaya becomes an extremely important middle path for you to get into a state of mind which is capable of correct perception, ethical action, and extremely powerful action.
So let me, Raghuji, let me explore a question here with you. So, the whole process of yoga, as you have just articulated, with the tapas, swadhyaya, and ishvara pranidhana, right? It all begins with the awareness of dukkha as a condition of being a human being, right? Dukkha.
Correct.
Now, for someone who feels that I'm very well balanced, I'm a very well balanced and a normal human being, and I don't have any dukkha. Of course, I have aches and pains that are normal to all human beings, and I have all the normal sufferings of, say, loss and grief and so on, which is all normal. But I'm not really afflicted by dukkha itself. Overall, I'm a happy person. I'm a balanced person. I can say confidently, I'm satisfied with my life. Okay. For such a person, would yoga be even applicable in the sense in which you are speaking about it?
No, it will not. Because there is a very clear sutra in the second chapter which says that the first viveka, the first insight that you have is the insight that I'm living in dukkha, I'm living in what is called bhoga. I'm just getting consumed by the world and the world is consuming me. This is the meaning of the word bhoga. And that recognition is an extremely important starting point. And the second step after that recognition is to also see that I am responsible for the way I feel and for what I experience. So you have to get away from any explanation of your inner states as belonging to something external to you.
Mhm.
So these are kind of preconditions. If you don't do that, I guess you'll go for hot yoga and, asana, pranayama, and thinking it's yoga. It's not yoga, because like I said before, there's a very interesting idea which comes up in Kena Upanishad. It comes up in so many things, that one of the questions that a human being who's aware asks is not just what is my experience, but where is it coming from? That's why it's even called Kena Upanishad. So this inward searching question, which repeatedly comes up in many Upanishads, this is the starting point. If I don't ask that internal facing question, then yoga doesn't start. You might be doing asana practice, but that's not yoga.
I mean, it could be, we could say it's maybe the beginnings of yoga, but not really the culmination of it. Perhaps it's a stage in the development of yoga. Could we frame it that way?
Krishnamacharya wouldn't agree.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, he's
Okay.
very clear, right? Unless I ask this question, how am I creating my dukkha? Yoga doesn't start.
So now, is it fair? Anandji wants to say something. Okay, Anandji, go ahead.
Yeah, I recall a statement. A 17th century Maharashtrian poet, saint called Ramdas, says at one point that only the person who has been struck by some variety of dukkha, the turn toward adhyatma or self-development does not start. Now, someone who is riding high on his or her own success and think that the world is for me, I can do what I want, where is the need to go to anybody? They are in their own, in their own world. But any time that a certain sense of incompleteness, there is something missing that is happening, self-inquiry does not start in the direction in which yoga would want you to start.
Yeah. So I think, these are important points that we have to perhaps explore what is the nature of dukkha itself a little bit more, in order to more clearly unravel or unravel is the best word I can come up with. Unravel, unpack, or the yoga, the process of yoga, right? So
okay.
So, so what is dukkha is a question here. And I just want to preface it by using a word that has already been used, a feeling of being incomplete in life, in some way being dissatisfied, living in a state of discontent, whether it is with reference to one's circumstances in life or relationships in life and professional life. So what is dukkha really in a contemporary context?
See, Kalyanji, I don't think there is a difference between dukkha in a contemporary context and in any context. It's the same. Yeah. So let me go into a little bit of a very, all the Sanskrit words are very descriptive. Yeah. So kam means space.
Yeah.
Dukkam means any space which is distorted or has disturbances in it, right? Or is dusty and covered up in some way is dukkam. Another very interesting meaning for the word kam is the hub, the hole in the center of a wheel is also called kam. So dukkam is that this hole in the center of the wheel is not exactly in the center. It's off, right? And the human being is often compared to a chariot. So you have two wheels which are not centered and you're trying to live your life. That is dukkha, right? Losing your ability to make choices, what meaning I should make of the world is dukkha.
Mm.
So this experience is quite a simple experience, and most of us go through it, right? And we go through various shocks of various kinds. Every shock distorts the inner space in some way or the other, right? So all of these are an experience of dukkha. And Anandji was talking about conditioning from the outside
Mhm.
through reward and punishment. Now, yoga talks about something very different. It talks about an inner attachment to things of pleasure and an inner aversion to things that cause pain, which again is a distortion of one's inner space, because then one starts living in the past and you're not living in the present.
Hmm.
Yeah. And there's another very interesting definition that Krishnamacharya gives. He says every human being is capable of experiencing navarasa, the 9 rasa, the 9 qualia of emotion, if I may use that word. Maybe Anandji can tell us whether it's the right word I'm using or not. Yeah. Now, being able to experience all of these emotions fully in your life without any block whatsoever, without any residue once you've experienced it, you come back to a quietness, is his definition of a person without dukkha. It's a joyous person who can respond to the world exactly as it is appropriate. So if I have to be sad, I'm sad. If I'm happy, I'm happy. I'm not carrying any residues. I'm not running after pleasure. I'm not running away from pain, because life is going to give me both. And I'm living in a state of balance.
Okay. So,
Anandji wants to say something.
yes, Anandji.
Um, at the start of the aphorisms of or stanzas of Sankhya system, it starts with 3 types of dukkha. And one type of dukkha is from the external sources. So I'm walking on the streets and all of a sudden a car is waving in my direction. I'm afraid, that fear, that undesirable experience, or there is a bully in the neighborhood who is threatening our lives. These are external sources of dukkha. On the other hand, there are internal sources of dukkha. One of them would be that I've eaten too much last night and I'm feeling uncomfortable or pain in my stomach. That's an internal one, but it is physical one. But on the other hand, somehow things are not going well and I'm feeling restless, I'm feeling anguished. That is an internal source. And as Raghuji was saying, there is no sharp division between mind and body, as Western systems since Descartes have made a dichotomy. So there is a complete continuum of various ways in which not only the outer environment, but the inner environment also is affecting me and not letting me feel the best I could be. The best I could be, as Raghuji was quite nicely experiencing, is that there is a wide range of feelings that we are all capable of, and one feels restricted that I can't feel that way. That is incompleteness.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not just that, I don't feel a particular emotion. It's sort of I'm not even aware that I'm unable to feel those emotions, right? I mean, the range is already cut off in some way.
If the fire is raging next to me and I am not afraid, that's abnormal.
Exactly. It will lead to deep dukkha.
That's right.
Okay, so Raghuji, now I want to focus a little bit on the course Antaranga Yoga itself. Okay, can you create for our audience, what is that course? How is it designed and structured? And what can people expect from that course from the standpoint of deconditioning the mind.
Okay, I'll have to go a little bit back into what we were discussing, Anandji and I and you, and then come into this. Yeah. See, one of the very interesting ideas that is put forth in the Yoga Sutra and in yoga theory in general is that there are 3 levels of the mind. Yeah, so it talks about one level of mind which is engaging with the superficial, with the world of discrete realities, which is an important part of the mind which does the planning for you. Okay, if people are interested in the Sanskrit, it's called the manas. Yeah, there's another second level of the mind, a deeper, more subtle level of the mind, which does not see things in such discrete forms, but can understand the qualities of things and so on, which is called the ahankara. And unfortunately, the word ahankara has got a bad press. Yeah, in yoga, it's a very simple word. It simply means that part of me which is able to create a sense of identity and says, this is me. Yeah, a very simple way of understanding the functioning of this part of the mind is when you eat food, there's an intelligence that says what should be retained in the body and what should be thrown out. If I didn't have that intelligence and the body working through that intelligence, this body cannot be maintained. So ahankara is this particular capability, which if you just extrapolate it to all forms of engagement with the world, I'm constantly doing this and creating a sense of self, which has got some integrity and a continuity. Yeah, this is a very critical part of my functioning, except that I shouldn't get caught with it. The third most deep level is called buddhi, which is a pure awareness where there is no distortion. It can perceive exactly what is. Now, when we get conditioned, we are mostly stuck with either the manas, which is the calculating mind because I'm afraid of something, I'm constantly vigilant and so on, or with identity, which is what we refer to as egotistic and all of that, right? Now, the Yoga Sutras, when it's talking about Swadhyaya, gives us a very beautiful way of being able to see the processes of the mind. Yeah, this is called discovering the Sakshi Bhava and the Sakhi Bhava. The Sakshi means to be able to have a meditative, compassionate inquiry into who I am and be part of and locate myself at the subtlest part of me and watch the rest of me in operation. Yeah, and the Sakhi Bhava is to be able to watch this without being judgmental. Yeah, to have a lot of curiosity and compassion in the way I'm watching myself. Now, how do you get here? You get here by using stories. So the Mahabharata, which is what I use in the program, is an excellent device through which one can do this reflection. Yeah. So how do you use the story? You use the story by, when you read a story like this, because it's written in such a powerful way, it moves you, right? Now, one of the responses that people usually have is to not get in touch with how I'm moved, but to start analyzing the character, right? That is not Antaranga Yoga, right? Antaranga Yoga is to be able to ask the question, who is the Yudhishthira in me? Right? Who is the Bhima in me? And the 5 archetypal energies through which we can understand ourselves are the 5 Pandavas. Right? And the stories are so beautifully crafted that each of the 5 has a counterpoint and different types of counterpoints. Right? So the heroic side of me, which can look at order and so on, is Yudhishthira. So there's a part of me which loves order, and if I am aware, I know how to establish order, right? I can also become a Bhishma, and get stuck with the current order or the old order in such a way that even under a very powerful context, which in front of me is emerging and saying, I can't hang on to the old, I continue to hang on to the old. So I can look at both. I sometimes get caught with just hanging on to old ideas, given realities, shoulds and musts, and cause a lot of dukkha to myself, right? Or I could, be so tight and so controlled that there's a part of me wishing to gamble with life, right? So when the dice
There
is thrown,
there is a gambler in all of us.
there's a gambler in us. The gambler in us is the hidden part of the Yudhishthira in us. That's what the story is telling you. And if you start examining yourself, you see how true this is. Yeah. So all the repressed and the suppressed emotions, like Anandji might say, that a very disciplined person is pushing down into himself, will come out at an appropriate time. So these stories become very, very beautiful lenses through which to understand your own behavior. Yeah.
Okay.
And when you create a context, a group of people who start trusting each other, and there's a feeling of safety, it's been amazing to me how much work is getting done over the web. Yeah. When I started it, like you remember, I was a little skeptical, saying, how do we do this on the web? But I'm just amazed with the kind of reflections people are coming up with, the depth to which they're going when they're looking at themselves. Yeah, the way they then start relating to how I behave like a Yudhishthira in some contexts. Yeah, how can I evoke the more heroic part of this archetype of mine, right? Or Draupadi or Karna or whatever these figures are. They're so beautifully crafted. And one of the readings that Anandji suggested to me, Girindra Shekhar Bose, yeah, he actually, in one of his statements, Anandji, he says that the Mahabharata is the most brilliantly composed set of case studies of the human mind.
Yeah.
It really is. It really is. And it's so beautifully written, so evocative that it helps you to get there. But the key to this whole thing, Kalyanji, is I have to go to the archetypal in me. If I stay with the stereotypical, then I'm still in a conditioned mind. And then I start moralizing, I start analyzing, I start doing all kinds of things which actually don't help me to understand myself.
So your
deconditioning process that happens when I go to the archetypal.
Yeah, very, very, very good. So what you are saying essentially is that there is the story of the Mahabharata, the drama of it, as represented as a phenomenon that happened, which we can entertain ourselves with, as something outside of ourselves, Bahiranga, or Adi Bhautika, if you might use a different word, right?
Yeah.
But there is also the move that you can make towards Adhyatmika, and move towards Antaranga through the lenses of these characters as archetypes.
Yeah.
And you're saying that your course is designed to invoke a certain kind of line of inquiry into ourselves, using these characters as doorways into that inquiry.
Yeah. And the dramatic situation in which they're placed, both.
Okay.
That's why it's so exciting. It's not just a character study, na?
Yeah.
It's how this person engages with certain contexts.
Yeah. So I just want to very quickly say that the Antaranga Yoga course is coming up in the fall quarter, and it's open for registrations. Ankur is going to post the link to get to the course. So for those of you who are interested, I think this is a good time to just register for the course. So you could take the link with you, and if you find yourself in a place in life where some directed self-inquiry in a safe environment might be appropriate for you. This is a wonderful course to get.
Just let me
yeah.
quickly. There are ways in which in recent developments in psychology in the late part of the 20th century, there was a psychologist by the name of George Kelly, who used role playing as a therapeutic method. One of the ways in which it is applied is to ask a person to role play the other side. Suppose a person is having big difficulties in facing his boss. Then in an artificial situation, in a dramatic form, the person is asked to play the role of his boss who he is afraid of. And this is the way of decentering. That is also Sakshi Bhava is created in modern therapeutic techniques in a different way. But what Raghuji is saying basically is that one very useful way of decentering yourself or developing Sakshi Bhava is to put yourself into a character of, because the Mahabharata has such a broad range of characters that anybody can see yourself reflected into one of those characters. And Raghuji's technique of putting them in a trusting environment in a small group and allowing them, the individuals, to come forth with their inner feelings is an extremely powerful way of what I can say, therapeutic practice.
Yeah, excellent. All right, there are several questions in the Q&A window. We'll get to them. Okay.
Can I launch the poll?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead and launch the poll.
So if you are interested in this course, please fill out this poll. The link is in the chat. If you have questions, fill out that maybe I have questions, and we'll have a counselor call you. Don't just say yes if you are trying to be nice. Fit one of these categories so we can follow up appropriately. Thank you.
Okay. Now, may I move to another part of the webinar now? So I think, you know, there is this whole domain of deconditioning at the level of the personal, meaning I as an individual being able to and being willing to discover not only ways in which my ways of thinking and being in the world, responding to my circumstances is conditioned by you know, impressions, you know, beliefs and other constraints from my own past experiences and so on. But there's a whole other domain in which deconditioning has an important connotation, and that is in the realm of you know, colonization and decolonization. And Dr. Clinton Singh is here with us. He's directing an area of study in HUA that's called post-colonial Hindu studies. It sort of explores the question, what is Hindu studies after colonialism, post-colonial Hindu studies? What does it mean? And he's offering a course in the fall quarter, which is about to start very soon, called Anti-Colonialism and Post-Colonialism. And I'd like to invite Dr. Clinton Singh to say a little bit about conditioning, deconditioning in the context of colonization and decolonization. Over to you.
Thank you very much. So let me begin from where we began the webinar today. Anandji spoke about conditioning, and he spoke about, you know, how conditioning is spoken about in Western psychology. And as he rightly pointed out, when we look at Western psychology as a discipline, this whole idea of deconditioning the mind is actually not present. And as Sri Kalyan Viswanathan pointed out as well. With regards to deconditioning of mind, I too was familiarized with this concept by Sri J. Krishnamurti, who used to emphasize on the need to decondition in order to liberate ourselves. Now, as my journey proceeded and I got into the teachings of Advaita Vedanta and the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, I became profoundly aware that mind is not the ultimate instrument of knowledge. Within the Indian tradition, and this has been approached from many different directions and vantage points, mind is not considered the ultimate instrument of knowledge. In fact, it is considered as a limitation of knowledge. It constrains you in getting to the ultimate, in getting to the knowledge of the ultimate reality. So it is from that perspective also that transcendence and transmutation of mind becomes very important. One has to get beyond mind. And of course, you know, when the transcendence is being spoken about, then the details of mind will be discussed. So when you look at the tradition of Advaita Vedanta, for instance, what is it that you find? You find that what is known as mind today has basically four components or four parts. Mind within the Vedantic tradition, or more precisely in the tradition of Advaita Vedanta, it is called Antahkaran. And Antahkaran has four aspects to it: Chitta, Manas, Buddhi, and Ahankara. Raghuji has already spoken about Manas and Ahankara, so I'm not going to go into the details. But what I want to emphasize here is that mind has these four components. And mind is like a piece of cloth which gets dyed in the milieu in which it is raised. In other words, it basically gets conditioned by the narrative with which you are surrounded. It is the narrative in which you find yourself. In post-colonial Hindu studies, what we have been doing is that we have started looking at the narrative which was produced on Indians and Hindus by the colonialists, by the colonial masters. And as many of you would know, this entire narrative was pumped into the educational system in the 19th century. And it has become part of the regular mainstream narrative. We breathe this narrative. And as we breathe this narrative, we continually condition our mind. Now, as we also discussed, Ahankara is part of mind. If we conflate Ahankara with our identity, this narrative that we have been subjected to, it formulates our identity as well. It impacts our identity. It shapes our identity. It shapes our ego, if you will. Now, let me go back to what I said earlier. Now, in order to get to the knowledge of the ultimate, the transcendence of mind is extremely important. So we can safely say that transcendence of ego, buddhi, chitta, manas also becomes very, very important. Now let me here introduce another aphorism which Sri Aurobindo was very fond of talking about. He would say, ego was the helper, ego is the bar. What does he mean by that? He says that in spiritual process, the formation of healthy ego or proper ego is extremely important for its ultimate transcendence. If your ego or your identity is not formed properly, you will not be able to transcend it and get to the ultimate. Now, this entire colonial narrative, which was designed to create a certain sense of inferiority in us, continually impacts our ego as well as mind. So from the yoga standpoint also, it becomes incredibly important that we critically examine this narrative and look at how it is impacting our identity formation. And here also, Swadhyaya is important. The impact of this negative, nefarious colonial narrative on our identity can only be examined if we look at how the colonial milieu continues to impact us in current times. And that is why in this course, Anti-Colonial and Post-Colonialism, what we are going to do is that we are going to use certain texts not written within the Indian context, but in the context of colonization elsewhere, which will ask us to examine our own identity formation in the light of certain questions that will be posed. So what is the whole idea behind this? The whole idea is to engage in Swadhyaya vis-a-vis the colonial narrative so that we allow the formation of our ego properly for its ultimate transcendence. In a certain sense, it is a process of recovery. And that is what we are going to do. So yes, the narrative happened in the outside, but we are going to look at how that narrative continually impacts us on the inside. That is where the focus is going to be, and it is going to require a lot of Swadhyaya. I'm going to bring stimulus through text in this class, but the ultimate objective is to make us study ourselves so that we transcend our ego and essentially our mind. And that is why I can safely say for this class, it is post-colonial Hindu studies as a form of yoga. So this is basically what I'm doing. This course is actually starting on 3rd of October, which is 1 week from now. I'm also giving an open house on this course tomorrow at 5 p.m. Pacific time. I'm in the chat window. I'm going to send you the details. I will paste the details. So if you want to come to that open house and ask specific questions, I will be very happy to answer them. But this is basically what this course is all about from the vantage point of yoga and deconditioning of mind. Over to you, Kalyan.
Okay, terrific, Kundan. Just some general comments before we move into a period of Q&A. Okay. First of all, our courses at Hindu University of America are organized as weekly sessions, live sessions, much like we are having today. And the schedule is posted on the website for each course. You know, we are very keen that all learning takes place in dialogue. And surprisingly, we have discovered that the COVID-19 circumstance that has been imposed on us globally has enabled us to discover a new realm of effectiveness in conducting dialogues globally through these Zoom sessions. It is not surprising, therefore, that Zoom is a company whose stock price is soaring in these COVID-19 times. But, you know, as sad as it is, and that so many people have suffered and are suffering from this disease, it's completely bahiranga. You know, it came from outside, and it has affected our world in ways that we could not have imagined. Really speaking, you know, it's almost like a once-in-a-lifetime event for most of us. And yet, you know, whether we are rich or poor, whether we are well placed in life or not so well placed, whether we are constrained and limited, or we have a lot of elbow room in our lives, the possibilities of discovering a deeper layer of a deeper sense of self and being able to respond to the world around us, the circumstances of our lives, and the possibilities and opportunities and the challenges that life throws at us is always there, is open to all. It's open to all, really. Rich or poor, west or east, whichever country you belong to. And the Mahabharata as a story, it has a tremendous potential at different planes of understanding, different planes of interpretation. You know, those who want to read only patriarchy into it, and they want to read only, you know, they want to project contemporary concerns, you know, recently cooked up by, say, the Frankfurt School of Cultural Marxism, for example, and projected on the Mahabharata. They are free to do so. And our notion is that's one possible interpretation. And the interpretation is limited by their own conditioning. You see, from a psychological paradigm, yeah, everybody approaches the Mahabharata from the level of psychological awareness where they are currently situated. You know, it's almost a law, you could say. So in the course, in our courses, we are taking these possibilities, the psychological possibilities of greater awareness and greater freedom from the, you can say, the constraints of our own Antaranga, our own inner identity, and exploring it in structured formats. So I think it's a very unique experiment. You know, Antaranga Yoga is not often actualized in university environments. This is in that sense, this is a unique experiment. Post-colonial Hindu studies also doesn't exist anywhere in the world. Hindus largely like to think that colonialism either never happened or that we have already overcome it. So therefore, it is unnecessary to examine that period of what happened. Unfortunately, in engaging in these courses, we will discover, and even I am discovering every day, how colonized I am, unbeknownst to myself. You know, and I think coming into these courses with a spirit of open-mindedness, you know, being willing to explore oneself, being willing to reveal oneself in the classes and so on, will be extremely valuable, I think, and even transformative. Okay, with that, we should take up some questions. You know, we've really crossed our hour, advertised hour, by 5 minutes, but we'll hang around and take a few questions. And Ankur, if you could kindly moderate and open up the questions, read the questions and open it up, the panelists can respond to them. Okay.
Thank you. I was also pulling some questions out of the chat box that went in early. Please put your questions in the Q&A. It's easier for us to see because the chat just flows. But something that came up earlier, isn't ethics more of a social construct? How does sattva's state of mind correlate to a social construct?
So I'd use that term. Kalyanji had told me not to use too many Sanskrit terms, so I used an English term. The Sanskrit term is dharma. Yeah, and the Sankhyan theory is very clear that Prakriti has an inherent capability of acting in ways that are dharmic, that are full of insight and knowledge, that lead to a disciplined engagement with life, which also has the capability of extraordinary ways in which it can act. So it's called dharmam, jnanam, aishwaryam, and vairagyam. It can also act in the opposite ways. So when the mind gets more and more clear, it automatically engages with life and the world through dharma, vairagya, and so on. So
I would add.
I use an easy term like ethics. Thanks for asking the question so I can clarify. I mean dharma.
And you know, I mean, I would want to just add one point to that, which is, see, dharma as a construct has two dimensions: samanya and visesha. Samanya dharma and visesha dharma. Samanya becomes universal, universally relevant and applicable, universally valid. And visesha is more culturally, ethnically, situationally derived from, you know, from your particular station, situation, stage of life, location, what is commonly in Sanskrit called desha and kala, you know, the place and time in which you're living. So today it has become very important to talk about patriarchy and how women were oppressed historically, etc. But if you project that onto an old, I'm responding because somebody asked a question in the chat window, that's why I'm saying that. If you project a contemporary value upon an ancient epic, you distort the value it is trying to espouse. Now, we prefer to do it the other way around, which is, what contemporary value does the ancient epic have for our humanity now? You know, in other words, we're trying to derive something of value in our contemporary times that can be applied for you and me in our lives right now. That's different than, completely different than, taking some contemporary notion of right and wrong and ethics and so on, and projecting it backwards in time on an epic that was written thousands and thousands of years ago, and then condemning the epic and condemning the people who wrote it 2000 years ago, which is a different time, a different age, a different place. What does that really do? That makes the scholar feel temporarily very good about himself, as though he or she has now mastered the epic. I mean, we find that pretty silly. And even though it is the current day, you know, the fashion in the academia, you know, it begs the question, what value is academia really adding other than starting and perpetuating cultural wars? So we don't want to go there. All right, Ankur, next question, please.
There was a lot of conversation on dukkha, right?
Dukkha.
So there's two pieces. I'll just run them together, and I think this has been answered, but I'll just open it up. So isn't dukkha and the self synonymous? And then is not dukkha also not a result of various painful realities of life, like deprivation, poverty, and the like? In that sense, is not yoga for those who have certain level of material attainment in their lives?
I didn't get the question, Ankur.
I'll rephrase it, Raghuji.
Yeah.
I'll rephrase it, okay? So, this whole idea of becoming free from dukkha or transcending dukkha, dukkham, as we say it, is it applicable only for people who have attained a certain measure of material well-being? What about the people who are stuck in poverty, who are trapped in such constraining, debilitating circumstances, where obviously their first priority would be to reshape their lives so that they can get out of the debilitating conditions of their lives? Will such minds be ever even open to the possibility of yoga? So, does that mean yoga then becomes relevant
Elitist.
only for,
Elitist.
is it elitist? Yeah, beautiful. That's a good way of saying it. Go ahead.
I don't think so at all, because some of the most beautiful treatises, songs about yoga have been written by people from every walk of life, right? In Tamil Nadu, you have this Aruvathu Moovar, the 63 saints. They come from very rich people, they come from very poor people, it comes from a whole range of people. And one of the ideas, Anandji also referred to it very briefly, is that when people are in circumstances which are very positive, right, they get so caught with the bhoga cycle, with the cycle of just consuming and getting caught with their power, that they do not understand dukkha at all. So it's actually the opposite. And this hierarchy of needs stuff is not part of Indian thought, right? So there are enough evidences where if you have a mind of a certain quality, you deal with whatever circumstance you have from tremendous maturity, and you become the best that you can be, whatever your context is. That is what yoga is all about. Yeah, and some of the yoga, I mean, Krishnamacharya himself didn't live in very great circumstances. He went through a lot of difficulty and worked through. So it certainly has no connection with the external circumstance. If you can start looking at the external circumstance in a certain way, then you start the process of yoga. Yeah, in fact, Anandji had also said that you need a measure of a negative experience to, in a sense, kick you into looking at dukkha carefully. What, Anandji?
The problem is that it is true that a whole lot of world's population is under poverty level, and for them any of these kinds of things would be luxury. But there is another perspective on it, which is that people who are getting out of poverty is although the number is in proportion is increasing. For some of those who are well fed and well looked after, pointing in the other direction, what you are saying is irrelevant to these people, a lot of poor people, therefore it doesn't apply to me, or that it's irrelevant, is another defense mechanism of avoiding your responsibility. So this is not to say, of course, I can be then says that, look, you are looking down on people who are poor. No, that's not the situation. It's taking responsibility.
I just wanted to add to this that, dukkha is basically an internal condition. It might get triggered by external circumstances, but it is predominantly internal. So, one could be in fabulous circumstances on the outside and yet feel dukkha.
Yes.
And at the same time, one could be in impoverished conditions and yet not feel dukkha. So it's completely how one perceives the external situation on which the perception of dukkha depends.
And in fact, Kundan, we could say that separation, that uncollapsing of the inner faculties, the
Absolutely.
inner self from the external circumstances, and separating the two, so that one's experience of life, of being alive, is fundamentally disconnected from the circumstances of one's life, is itself the beginnings of yoga.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Look at the example of Buddha, for instance.
Yeah.
Externally, he had everything, and then he goes out and sees a few things, and he wants to look for the ultimate meaning of life.
There is a concept in psychology called relative deprivation. That means you feel deprived in relation to your expectations in life. There was a billionaire, I forget the name of the gentleman, who was in Vancouver in his last days. Anything and everything that money could buy was at his disposal. But he died a miserable life because he thought that he was being surrounded by germs that will consume him. So it depends on, partly it depends on the perception of your situation. Dukkha is relative in that sense of the term.
Great, great. Next
Yes, Simon
question.
and Garfunkel wrote about them, na? This guy is called Richard Corey.
Huh. Very good.
Which song?
So is it possible for us not to think what we don't want to think? Is it actually required as a necessity to recondition or decondition our mind? And like our questioner, I find it very hard not to think about things I don't want to think about sometimes.
No. See, there's a very beautiful Zen koan na, that says, I'm going to give you this medicine. It's going to definitely work, but don't think of a monkey before you drink this. Yeah. See, unfortunately, a lot of effects that happen when you practice yoga, especially Antaranga Yoga, and clarify your mind, are treated as the means. Yeah. So let me just explain what I'm saying. Now, when you are able to quieten your mind through asana and pranayama, and then look at your mind very, very carefully, you're able to end conditioning. You're able to burn what are called the seeds of negative conditioning that you hold. Therefore, your mind becomes extremely quiet and silent. Most people teach yoga by saying, make your mind silent. You cannot make your mind silent. It's a consequence. Yeah. So the more you understand the processes of your mind, the more you have a choice of where you wish to direct it. Right. And this is the whole process that is talked about. So you start in Swadhyaya by understanding how your mind works, right? How does the ahankara trigger the manas? How does the manas trigger the ahankara? Where are you getting caught? And so on. And the more you're able to view this from your Sakhi Bhava and Sakshi Bhava, the more you gain choice making. And then I also gain a lot of energy, which is being wasted in compulsive responses to the outside. This energy and this mindfulness, I can now direct to whatever I want to direct to. That's the whole process that that's talked about, right? And I can direct it to anything. Yoga Sutra talks about 30, 40 ways in which you can direct it, some of which have to do with science, some of which have to do with power, some of which have to do with astronomy. Yeah.
Thank you.
So you cannot take the consequence and push it this way. Yeah. You can think whatever you want. You just have to figure out why you're thinking what you're thinking.
Yeah.
And after a certain stage, not think at all.
No, that happens as a consequence.
As a consequence, yeah.
Yeah, it's not that you don't think at all. What
Yeah.
the Yoga Sutra is saying is that the source of light fills your mind and not the reflection. Thoughts are reflections of the source of light. No? So you actually experience Purusha. So once you experience Purusha, all thoughts then become very pale. They're not interesting at all.
And in certain circumstances, they stop too, Raghuji, completely.
Yeah, of course they'll stop.
Yeah,
Wherever is necessary, it'll come up. Otherwise, it's not going to be around.
Yeah.
Okay. Next one. Are there actual people living in that state of bliss, capable of experiencing the Navarashas? Is it practicable, or more of an aspirational idea?
I think it's both. I know people who have been there. There are times when each of us experience that state. It's not this exclusive thing. Yeah. And you can work with it. Yeah. So the answer is simply yes. And that it's something every one of us can experience, right? You don't have to make it into something exotic.
Yeah.
Anandji?
Yeah. I met a gentleman who I later recognized as my guru. He was living in not quite poverty, but a very lower middle class, bare existence in a 2-room block. There was a whole family. His daughter, who was back home from her circumstances, 2 or 3 of her children, and basically a bare existence. And yet I saw him always in a very, very, very stable mind. And there is no question that he had reached a situation which is that of a sthita prajna. He was never disturbed. So I learned a lot of things from him. One day he says to me that, Anand, you have to realize that there is nowhere to go. There is no need to go anywhere. And when you realize that, you are yourself. Okay, so he himself has reached a situation. So the direct answer to the question that was just asked is that yes, there are people who are sthita prajnas who have a sakshi bhava. They witness, and they witness the world as it is without having that word reflect on them. Completely unconditioned mind. Yes, there are.
Yeah.
And I also want to add to this.
Yeah.
That
I know quite a few of them too.
Yoga texts,
Yeah.
yoga texts, come from experience. So these are not texts, based on ideas. It's not that people have sat there and spun ideas, which is also a kind of an understanding which was promoted during the colonial period. So I'm looking at it, from the perspective of colonial narrative, which could actually engender a question like this.
Yeah, Yoga Sutra itself starts by saying this is a sutra of experience. No?
Yeah.
It's an experiential process. It is not a theoretical process at all.
Yeah.
So every sutra has to be realized and practiced.
Very good. We've got some just technical questions on the course, assignments, how many students, how's the format? If you want to just talk about that, kind of also on both of your courses.
Should I go first, Kalyan?
Yeah, please go first.
Yeah,
I'll come later.
Yeah. See, the pattern of the course that I'm running is very simple. We send you stories from the Mahabharata that we've curated. Let's say you take Yudhishthira, there'll be a couple of stories that tell you about situations where he had difficulty. There'll be counter stories. So you read those stories and write a small self-reflective essay for yourself. So you start getting into the process of not getting caught with an analysis, or like Kalyanji said, not projecting our current frameworks of thinking onto something ancient, but you start understanding how to say, where is the Yudhishthira in me, or where's the Bhima, or whichever character in me. And then you'll be able to get into the whole inner location of seeing yourself through that lens, right? And then you come to the class and we have a dialogue, right? We usually have a smaller group speaking first so that it can be a lot more intimate. And then we open it out to a larger discussion. And that's the process. So it's a cyclical process. It's a Samudra Manthan process, if you know the Samudra Manthan, right? So you keep doing that Manthan and extraordinary things come out. Yeah. If you don't do the Manthan, nothing will come out. So we all do the Manthan together. And one thing that I can tell you is I enjoy the courses probably as much or more than any of the students who come there. Because it's just so beautiful and so, so brilliant to see people speak about themselves. The whole process is just beautiful. Yeah. So I've enjoyed it, and I continue to enjoy every one of those engagements. Yeah,
Great.
that's all the courses. You just read the story and we have fun. If any of the students who were there in the last course can chip in. Yes, Ellen, great. Yeah, we had fun, didn't we?
Great.
So in terms of the logistics, the course is scheduled for every, what is it, Tuesday or Wednesday now?
Thursday morning, nah? For me,
Thursday morning,
Wednesday,
India
Wednesday
time.
night for you people.
Wednesday evening, US time, around 8 o'clock, I believe it is.
9:30 p.m. Eastern time to 11 p.m. Eastern time.
Okay.
Starting on October 7th, will end December 16th. It's a 1 credit hour course, so kind of 3 hours a week.
No,
one
hour and a half classes per week and some assignments.
Correct.
And about double that in assignments,
Right.
3. Okay. I still have that.
No, wait. Ankur, wait. Kundan hasn't gone yet.
I know.
Yeah. Go ahead, Kundan.
So my course is a graduate level course. It's a 3-unit course. We'll be meeting for 3 hours every Saturday, beginning 3rd of October and continuing till 12th of December. There will be readings, every week, which students are expected to study well and come to the class for discussions. At the beginning of the class, there will be, a lecture from me, and then the class will become open for discussions. There will be lots and lots of discussions, and sharing of personal experiences. As I said, the whole idea is to promote Swadhyaya. So, that focus is going to certainly remain intact in the class all throughout. There will be a final paper towards the end of the class. And, it has to be written in an academic format. And I will be taking the class through all that is required to write a proper academic paper. The cap on my class at this point in time is 14. And if we exceed that number, I'm going to have 2 classes, because I don't want to exceed the number beyond 14. I want discussions to happen in class, because it's basically in these discussions that the juice comes out and the classes become relevant. So, that's all from me. If there's anything else that you want to add, Kalyan or Ankur. please.
I think we are reaching the 90-minute mark. We should close the webinar. I'm sure there are questions that weren't answered, but we can maybe pick it up and write to them again. Ankur, any last thing you want to address before we close?
No, thank you all for joining. We'll be following up. We have another webinar. I think it'll be the last webinar of this quarter before we take a little hiatus into the next quarter and our classes start. So please take a look at the courses, enroll in what is interesting to you, ask questions. We, like Kundanji said, we want to engage in conversation. And if we get more students, we'll make sure that we split the courses so that you are in the graduate level courses that we do that. Again, this has been an amazing discussion. I feel deconditioned a little bit. I'm ready to dig deeper.
And,
All right.
and there's open house on anti-colonialism and post-colonialism. You can share the details about that too, Ankur. You know, I've pasted
I
the
dropped
link
it in the
there.
chat as well. Yeah.
It is 5 o'clock Pacific time tomorrow. And, you know, I will basically be answering questions that prospective students may have.
Okay, so with that, I want to thank the audience for participating in today's webinar. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you sometime soon. Okay, namaste, everybody.
Namaste, everyone.
Namaste. Thank you. Namaste. Bye-bye.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Namaste.